Well, hello and good evening to you all, and welcome. I'm just going to run through a few images and talk a little bit about what we've been doing, why it's interesting, and so on, as Thomas said. Why think about place names at all, and what kind of fruit can it bear for us? I want us to think a little bit about what place names are. Place names are little cultural artifacts coined in a particular language using words which mean something. In other words, they're a kind of micro document, very short little documents. And that's actually, from a historical point of view, very important in Scotland, especially, where there are whole areas of the country with minimal medieval documentation, which will give us a window into those areas. So in some places, we find that these little micro documents, the place names, are a major linguistic resource for the historian and for the person interested in the way life was lived and the landscape was used and so on. What kind of things can we learn from place names? Well, we can talk about different kinds of farming, how the landscape was used, who lived here, who owned it, what language did they speak, who was in charge, what kind of lordship was being exercised, what kind of wildlife, how did people see the wildlife in their area and the plants and trees and so on. So I'm going to go through that kind of thing a little bit later, just to give it some examples from our database. What kind of territories, the boundaries of territories, that we'll see a couple of interesting slides about that kind of thing. So the process I've been engaged in for the last several months has been collecting names. The primary data set, the first port of call, if you like, for gathering a great big herst of names, has been the Ordnance Survey 6-inch first edition map, surveyed around the end of the 1840s and early 1850s, and then coming out 1853 to 1856, something like that, the actual maps following the survey. The survey itself is a very interesting process with lots of documentation from the surveyors, which still survives, which is also sometimes quite interesting. But the maps themselves provide the core data for this whole thing. But there are lots of names which were already extinct by the mid-19th century. So we go back to earlier maps. This one, for example, by Johannes Blau, the Dutch map maker, but he published this in 1654, but it's based on a manuscript made by Timothy Pont in the 1590s. So that's actually getting us back quite a long way into the early landscape, the shape of the landscape, and really much closer to a medieval picture of the world than our modern maps, even than the 19th century maps. Another important resource are legal documents. We have charters in which land is being granted or rented to somebody and so on. We have retours where the heir of one person who owned the land or held the land is confirmed on the death of the previous holder. Various legal documents and accounts, rent books and tax rolls and so on. So we have early forms of names from this kind of thing. So here in this charter from the mid-15th century, we have Shermers, Le Parc and Le Contreff, which no longer exist, and Erne Canny, that's now Erne McCanny. And early forms are very often a very useful way of understanding a name. Sometimes over a period of time, a name will get mangled. We'll come to maybe one or two examples of that as we go along. And getting earlier forms very often helps you to understand what the word, what the name, what language it was coined in and what it means in a way which the modern version might have disguised somewhat. For example, here's a word, a name which looks like it should be Muirdroch Wood, and it isn't a wood, and it's up in the muir, sort of, on high ground. And so you'd think you have some kind of idea what it might mean, but in fact, it's got nothing to do with the muir, and it's got nothing to do with any wood. And once you another piece of evidence that's very important to collect, along with alongside early forms is the pronunciation, the local pronunciation by people or families who've been there a long time. And in this case, what we thought was Muirdrochwood turns out to be Mardrochet, which sheds a whole different light on the name and immediately becomes more or less transparent as a Gaelic name. And if it's confirmed by the early forms of the name. So we've got Macdrochet in 1592, Mardrochet in 1645, Mark Drochet, very important, Mark Drochet, in 1654. And it means the markland of the bridge. A mark is a unit of currency, a unit of value, and it relates to the value of the land and the render that was payable to your superior as a result of your tenancy of that land. And of course, it's right beside the bridge over the River Ken. It's the Mark Drochetje, the markland of the bridge. Interestingly, if you look at the 18th century map on the left of your page here, you'll see another name right below it is Brigmark, which means exactly the same thing. Brig is bridge and Mark is Mark again. But that's a Scots name, not a Gaelic one. So the two farms, each of them valued at 1 mark on either side of the river, one the Gaelic form and one the Scots form, saying exactly the same thing about those two farms. They're a markland beside the bridge. And you can see in that map, actually in the bottom of that little map, Brig of Ken, where the bridge crossed the River Ken. I quite like that little collection there. All this information was gathered over several months and stuffed into an enormous database with lots of different fields in it. The place name, whether it's obsolete or not, what parish it's in now, what parish it used to be in, the grid reference, how sure we are about its locality, its location, its grid reference. We entered analysis for it, various research notes, and early forms on a separate entry form in the page, and also, of course, the elements of which that name is composed, like Mark Drochet, Mark and Drochet. And so, as of today, this map contains exactly 2,545 dots. That shows the area which has been covered by our survey, and the distribution of the dots corresponds exactly to the 7 parishes which we have been looking at, except for Kirkcudbright, which I just felt had to be in there, and the mouths of 2 rivers, the and the Dee, because we give the grid reference for any river, we give it at the mouth of that river. So those 2 rivers, although they do flow through our area, their grid references are outside our area. So that's a very brief introduction to what we're doing. And now I'll invite Thomas to continue a little on some looking at some of the parish names in the area.
Well, thanks very much for that introduction to the whole business that you in particular have been at. So what I'm going to talk about just in this next little section is about the different languages of our area. This is one of the richest areas of Scotland in terms of the different languages that are represented in the area. And I'm going to sort of demonstrate that a bit by taking you through the parishes that were being, some of the parishes that we've been surveying, the parish names. And I think it's a handy way of seeing how rich and layered is the linguistic landscape that the Galloway Glens presents us with. So I won't go through everything in detail, but the basic layers here that you can see are a Brittonic layer. That is a language that people refer to in various different ways, sometimes as British, sometimes as Northern Brittonic or Northern British. It's a language very closely related to Welsh, and at its earliest stages, the language in this neck of the woods was probably indistinguishable from the language being spoken in southern Britain. After that, probably starting in the late 7th century or mid 7th century, Old English, the Old English language spoken in Northumbria, comes into the area because the Kingdom of Northumbria makes conquest of Galloway. In the 9th to 11th century, there's a kind of hazy period where we actually have very little idea what's going on. But the place names present us with the evidence to suggest that there are speakers of Old English, of Norse, of Brittonic, and of Gaelic, all living side by side during this period, before Gaelic begins to predominate in the 11th, 12th centuries and beyond. And then at some point in the 12th to 13th century, Scots begins to come into the area as well. And Scots in the modern period, particularly in the 20th and 21st century, has kind of elided into what tends to be referred to as Scottish Standard English, English spoken with a kind of Scottish vocabulary and sometimes accent as well, particularly when it comes to place names. So this is the kind of these are the different layers of languages that are presented to us. This isn't, not everywhere in Scotland has all these different languages, but our region does. It's not every single bit of the Galloway Glens landscape partnership area that we surveyed. We surveyed 7 different modern parishes at the kind of northern end of the Galloway Glens area. These ones here, so that's north to south: Carsphairn, Dalry, Kells, Balmaclellan, Parton, Balmagee, and Crossmichael. Carsphairn actually didn't exist in the Middle Ages. It was a creation in the 17th century. We guess probably out of the northern parts of Kells and Dalry. I mean, it was more than a guess, really. What I'm really going to talk about just now is kind of take you through some of these parish names and show you a little bit about their linguistic background. We do have represented most of those languages in the parish names. There is one Northern Brittonic name. It's lost now, but the older name of Balmaclellan Parish was probably, and we were guessing slightly at its pronunciation, Trevor Carco. I'll say something about that in a moment. Parton probably goes back as far as the Old English period. Most of our parish names are Gaelic: Balmagee, Balmaclellan, Carsphairn, Crossmichael, Dalry, and Kells, and I'm only going to talk about a couple of those. There is no Scots or Scottish Standard English parish name, which is interesting, and it gives us some sense of, I suppose, the language depth of Scots as composed to these other languages. Though Parton, is very similar to Scots, I suppose. The exception, I suppose, is the modern name, often used on maps at any rate, of Dalry, St. Johnstown of Dalry, which has a Scots or Scottish Standard English kind of component to it. And our kind of earliest horizon for these parishes is an important document from the late 13th century, which gives us the different parishes of the Glenken region. Crossmichael isn't on this because it actually belonged to a different deanery, but the deanery of the Glenkens has 5 of our parishes on it. And this is the one place where we find this slightly mysterious name, Trevor Carco. Now, as far as Northern Brittonic goes, this is the name for the kind of medieval stage of this language, which goes back even further. So once upon a time, north to south in Britain, there was a Celtic language, which people often refer to as Brittonic, sometimes as British, which pretty much covered the map. And that is represented in our area as well, particularly by the river names, and particularly by the River Dee, which goes back to, we have it attested as early as the 2nd century AD as Deva, the goddess, the river goddess, presumably. And there are a lot of parallels for that name. But most of the Brittonic names we have from our area are coined in the medieval period. And Trevor Carco is one of them. It has an element meaning a settlement or farm, treve. You find this element in Wales all over the place. Tref is just a modern name for a farm or settlement in Wales. And after that, it has an element meaning the. So this is the farm of the something, and we do not have time to get into whatever the something is. This is not the place for it. But one thing that's important about this, the form of this name, is that the presence of that definite article, we know this from comparative studies elsewhere, probably means this line, although it's from the earliest language represented here, it's actually quite a late name, probably coined no earlier than the 10th century. There are other Tref names in the locality. Thrive is the one people will be most familiar with, which just means the settlement. As I said, at some point, Old English comes into the area, probably under the guise of a conquest of the area by the Kingdom of Northumbria and also by its church. Parton is probably, the parish of Parton probably represents this stage of Old English as well. The second element in it, tune, like Tref in Brittonic, tune in Old English means a farm or settlement. Trouble is, it's still used that way. People make up, if you think about the children's cartoon program Chuggington, people make up names with ton in them all the time. So it's quite hard to tell when a tune name comes from, but we're pretty sure this goes back to the Old English period. I'm not so sure about what the first element is, and Gilbert and I have had long discussions about whether it could have pairs in the title, whether that's even possible, or whether it's an enclosure form or something else we haven't thought of. Now, you might think, oh, Old English, really? But there are a number of other names in the locality, actually in the parish or next to the parish, that are also Old English. Sharmers, which forms the boundary between Parton and Balmaclellan, or probably did at one stage, and a Swinton, which survives only in the name of Glen Swinton, goes back to another tune name, Swintun, a pig farm, basically. Not a glorious name, but there you go. So that's just to show you where Sharmers is. A nice, actually the borders probably shifted a wee bit, but it more or less is on the border between these two parishes. So Daphne Brooks' suggestion a long time ago that this represents Old English Shir Yamada, shire boundary or parish boundary, is probably a good one. This Glen Swinton is only found in a composite place named Glen Swinton. And what you can see from this name, very importantly, is that Gaelic followed on from Old English, at least in this name. So it's a Gaelic name that incorporates an earlier Old English name. So that sense of the layers of place names starts to become more apparent. And we probably have some representation of that Old English element in the landscape also in the earliest name of Balmagee Parish, which was Kirkandrews. There's a lot to talk about here, which I won't talk about, but I suppose really just to say that in both aspects of this name seem redolent of that Old English influence. The word Kirk probably, it's difficult to know whether it's Norse or Northern Old English word that was then loaned into Gaelic to form names, particularly with saints' names after them, meaning the Church of Saint so-and-so. Whole lot of these in Galloway. But also the Saint Andrew, who has a particular, whose cult really got going in the Northumbrian Church in the late 7th century. And so both these aspects of Balmagee's first name probably represent a sort of Old English dimension, even though the name itself, as it stands, is probably Gaelic. So most of our parish names, though, are Gaelic, and this is true of most of the major settlement names in our area. Indeed, throughout the whole of Galloway, most of the major settlement names are Gaelic. That is the dominant language in the landscape, even if you're not always aware of that. I won't be talking about Kells, the wooded place, or Cross Michael, St. Michael's Cross or Crossing, or Carsfairn, the Carse of the Alder. But I will say a little bit more about Balmagee, Balmaclellan, and Dalry before shutting up. So we've already seen Kirkandrews Kirkanders as the earliest name of Balmagee. But at some point, a settlement name locally seems to take over from it as the name of the parish. And this is quite interesting. It uses a Gaelic word, balla, meaning a settlement or a farm. One of the most common words, names for elements rather used for this in Gaelic. But a word that only really starts to be used for place names in Scotland, as far as we can see, in the 12th century, the very, very late 11th century. And in this neck of the woods, you can pretty much date when this element starts being used. It probably starts being used in the 13th century or so. And you can see it in these names. So Balmagee and also Balmaclellan contain as their second elements family names. So this is the Balla of the Magees, of the family of Macquarie. This would have been pronounced Maguive or Maguive originally, and that's what you're seeing in these early forms, Balmaceth and the like. And Balmaclellan is the family name Machgelulan, the son of the servant of Saint Philin. That's what MacLellan means. So both these Balla names have family names, and we know a little bit about both these families. We know when they kind of become prominent, and you can even see them owning these lands. Look at this, Gilbert Magee, the Lord of Balmagee in the 15th century. You can see their relationship to the places as well. Just finally to mention Dalry, it's very difficult to know how old any of these Gaelic names are because it was dominant for such a long period of time. But Dalry maybe gives us a little bit of a hint. This is the water meadow or hoch, the dal of the king. And you can see what a cracking holm or water meadow or hoch it's got. And any of you who know the town know exactly where this is. But the reference to a king might suggest to us that this is something coined in a period when this area had a king who spoke Gaelic. And that might take us back into the 12th century and maybe slightly before. After which the rulers of the area would have been referred to as the Lords of Galloway and probably not thought of themselves as kings. The other reason to mention Dalry, and this is my final slide, is that this is the one place where Scots begins to show through in the parish name. You can see this place starting to be referred to not as Dalry Parish, but as St. John's Cloghan, and eventually St. Johnstown of Dalry. And that coincides with a period when other major towns in the area begin to have Scots or Scottish Standard English names, places like New Galloway and Castle Douglas as well. Right, so that's my whistle-stop tour of the parishes and the languages of the area, and Gilbert's going to take over from here for a while.
Thanks very much, Thomas. So let's talk a little bit about in more detail about some of those themes that we very briefly touched on in my little introduction. Thomas has just been talking about Dalry or Dalry, the King's Hoch. Interestingly, it's right beside the Earlston. Are these two lands associated with a king and an earl or an aristocrat of some sort, maybe earlier than the earls? Is it a coincidence that these two settlements are cheek by jowl? Anyway, names which reflect patterns of lordship, although it's very hard to discern now from these names exactly how the earl or the king manifested their authority at or through or in these sites. Lordships, of course, are territorial, and we have a name like the Water first appears in the 12th century from the river Aflumene Hur, from the Gaelic Or, meaning a limit or a boundary. And the Or is still the limit between Cucurbishire and Dumfriesshire. It's also the boundary between two deaneries in the Middle Ages. And who knows how much further back that river as a boundary its history as a boundary goes into the past. as soon as it appears, it's already an ecclesiastical and a secular lordship boundary, and its name reaffirms that important sense of its territorial use. We have lots and lots of names which refer to wild animals of various sorts. Clashbrock, the ditch or hollow of the badgers, Clashnambrock. Ochenshinnach, the field of the foxes. People are aware of the wild animals around their settlements. They name features of the landscape after the wild animals. It's quite interesting, that does this imply a certain consistency of use, one might ask. Craig Gower, the Goat's Rock or Cliff, was there always a goat on it? Is it habitually there? Or did something interesting happen one day with a goat on a particular day, which gave rise to a local name for, a goat fell off the cliff or something? Al-Hwat is Al-Khat, the Wildcat's Rock or Cliff. Fumat Ligat is that gate separates the farmland, the infield, if you like, separates the infield land around Earlston from the hill grazing. The Ligat is very often a demarcation between two sections of the farmland. Quite why the polecats are associated with that gate, I don't know. Todd's Hill Todd is a Scots word for a fox, and then with lots of transparent names: Otter Isle, Deersden, Goatburn, Goatcraig, Harecleuch. All these are animals, pretty much, which I think are still present, with the possible exception of the Fumat. I don't know if there are wild polecats anymore in that part of Galloway. There are probably a few escaped ferrets, which are the same animal, but not the original wild polecats. Place names which refer to birds, perhaps habitual roosting places, or nesting places, or again, places where some event took place. Sometimes we actually hear a record. We have a place called Snake Bank, for example, where something terribly gruesome happened, with snakes crawling into a girl's mouth and basically eventually killing her. So that people, names have a particular story in mind relating to an animal which gives rise to a name. Very occasionally that story survives, but otherwise we don't really know. So Paul Shag refers to the shavak, the hawk, usually a peregrine falcon, but not always the peregrine. Petillery, I'm not quite sure what the first element is, but Ilera, the eagle, and it's right up it's on a big hill in the north of Carsfern Parish, where we know there were eagles up until the end of the 19th century and possibly beyond, and maybe coming back now as they begin to make their presence felt in the border areas. Dunveach is the Hill of the Ravens. And then, of course, in Scots, we have Ravenscraig. Glede Craig, Glede, or more commonly Gled, is the red kite. I will come back to that in the second half of this discussion, because there's an interesting feature about the distribution of the Glede Craigs. But clearly, the red kite, or possibly the buzzard, but I'm more likely there's more commonly used of the red kite. The Gled was around in our area before being hunted to extinction, and has now made a comeback. Corby Craig, the crow, the heron strand, birds giving rise to place names. And fish. Most of the charters which grant land in our area to whoever is going to take possession of it mention the rights to fish. Fishing is clearly an important part of the economy. Throughout the Middle Ages and the early modern period, fishing is regularly mentioned. Even in the statistical accounts in the 18th and 19th centuries, the great hauls of salmon and so on that are taken out of our rivers are regularly mentioned, and the right to do that. So Lein Breden is Lein a Braden, the salmon burn, and there's a fine salmon leaping up some burn. It's not actually our burn. Loch Brack is presumably Loch Freck. It could be the speckled loch, but that seems a slightly strange name. But of course, the speckled fish, par excellence, is the trout. Loch Freck is the loch of trout. The ged is the old Scots word for a pike, and our early modern sources regularly refer to pike being taken from the rivers and the lochs, and there are several names which refer to geds. Not the tastiest of fish, not the most exciting bit of cuisine, I would have thought, but still significant and important enough to give its name to various bits of water. And Eel Spring Strand, lovely name. Eels, I don't know if eels are still significantly present in our area. The British eel population has declined by 95% in the last 3 decades. Extraordinary collapse of the whole species, which has been in the past an enormously important economic and culinary resource. Place names also referring to trees. Bar Sciach is the hill of hawthorns. Paul Bay, the birch tree burn. Armdarach, the share or division of the oak trees. Loch Goosey is the loch of the pine wood. Interestingly now, if you look at all the conifers scattered all over the upland part of our territory, vast swathes of Sitka spruce, but actually there are only, in our entire area, in our historic place names, there are only 2 names that refer to conifers, Loch Goosey and Pine Hill in Scots. So they don't make a big mark on the toponymy of the landscape. Well, they presumably were there. There were probably more than 2 pine trees in the landscape back in the day, but they didn't seem to make a big impact on the toponymy. Oaks, very important economic resource and an ecological resource as well. They support vastly more invertebrate life than almost any other tree in the country. The big oak of Earlston, it was already important enough. That's it there on the right-hand side of your screen. That oak tree was already important enough in 1786, more than 200 years ago, nearly 2.5 centuries ago. It was already important enough to attract its own particular place name on an early map. Achy bush, that old form of the Scots ache, the oak tree. And then lots of thorn trees, probably usually hawthorn, whitethorn, or they possibly relating to blackthorn in some cases. The number of the thorn trees in the place names, there are several of them, may signify particular importance in the hawthorn. It has a lot of interesting associations, sometimes with ritual. It's often used as in charters as a boundary marker, separating 2 territories. It appears in charters where some kind of legal settlement takes place at the thorn tree of such and such a place, very often a thorn tree in a kirkyard. So it may be that there's something about the hawthorn, which gives rise to the numerous place names in Thorn itself or in Sciach. There are a few in Sciach as well. We can learn something of the farming practices. We've already seen Swinton, the pig farm. Parton could be the pear farm, or possibly the enclosure farm, in Old English. So we're already getting glimpses of 2 kinds of farming in the Old English period. In Gaelic, we have Blair Muck, for example, the field of pigs. It was called Blair Muck until the owner, in the 19th century, against all the local residents who gave the name as Blair Muck, he insisted it was Blair Michael, and it was going to be Blair Michael henceforth in Crossmichael Parish, and it now is Blair Michael. It's a kind of process in which posh folk make their place names a little bit more posh sounding. Blair Muck, it's a bit of a mucky kind of name. Airy, as it's now called, we've got a few names containing this Gaelic word Ari, the shieling, the summer grazing, where animals were taken off, usually up into the hills, into areas where they could graze safely and contentedly in the summer, but it was too cold and too exposed or too wet in the winter. Knockley, the Calf's Hill. And what's interesting is that neither in Old English nor in Gaelic, as far as I can remember, do we have any reference to sheep farming in those two earlier linguistic strata. But when Scots and English appear, we have lots of names referring to sheep farming. It's almost as if the animals were waiting for the language, or vice versa. I don't know, but you can see what it suggests is that there's been a significant change in use in terms of grazing, that cattle farming and pig keeping has perhaps given way to sheep farming at more or less the time when Gaelic had given way to Scots and English. So we have sheep hill, lamb rig, hog hill. A hog is a yearling sheep. Wether now, or wether is a castrated ram. Lots of sheep-related names, and lots of sheep rees. If you look at the Ordnance Survey 6-inch first edition, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of little stone enclosures for keeping sheep in all over the landscape, mostly on the upper ground. Evidence of arable farming, crops and so on. We have Fold of Wheat in English, actually, was Wheatfield in 1853, and Orchard Hill. We also have Carnaval, which is the cairn of the apple trees. And nearby, near Carnaval, we have Garryhorn. I've got a bit of a typo there. It should be Garryhorna. I lost a couple of letters. The barley field up on the hillside in Carstfern. A lovely green enclosed patch in what is otherwise a bracken-covered and heathery hillside. Hunting has also been a significant bit of the land use of our area. The Forest of Buchan and the New Forest, which was really the eastern part of the Forest of Buchan, stretched from Buchan in Glen Trool, probably 20 miles, 25 miles east, deep into the parishes of Kells and Carstfern, so in the northern part of our territory. A great big swathe of land, much of it wild, some of it farmed. So the Nova Foresta, the Forest of Buchan, gives rise to, there's a farm called Forest, now divided into upper and nether parts, I think, and that's also given rise to Forest Lane, lane being a local word for a burn, a stream. Polmaddy is the burn of the hound, possibly the hunting dog. It's in the hunting forest of the New Forest. And Castlemaddy may contain the same element, does contain the same element, and may refer to the same thing of keeping hunting dogs handy for when the times came to go on the hunt. Eldrick, which is not actually in our area, but it's interesting because it's from Aelric. It's the deer killing place. It's a kind of narrows where deer were driven off the hill by dogs and men on foot, and driven into a place for slaughter. And the Aelric was the place where these animals were gathered together and trapped in such a way that they could be dispatched swiftly by the hunters. And Le Parc in 1456, again, part of the management of deer, when you didn't have to kill the deer as soon as you had got them in your Aelric. You could drive them into a park, and they could be kept there for release or for further hunting, or, as we have records of, in fact, in the 15th and 16th century, they could be taken somewhere else to be hunted by somebody else in their park. We've got records of Mary Queen of Scots doing that in Holyrood and Falkland and Fife and so on. All kinds of ways of managing deer. So hunting's an important part of this landscape use as well. So what we have here is a number of names which give us brief glimpses, little windows into the way that land was used, and the objects and the animals and the things in the landscape which made a sufficient impression on people for whatever reason to give rise to these names. So that's the end of our PowerPoint. We have really now a few minutes to where we can if people want to raise any questions or make some observations about anything that's gone on hitherto, please, some of you may already have done so, send a little note to Nick, who is patiently waiting for responses.
Yeah, we've got a number of questions, about a dozen or so that have come through, and comments and things like that. The very first question comes from Brian, and it's quite to many of the experts in the room may seem a fairly straightforward question, but I'm certainly not an expert. I don't think it's necessarily straightforward at all. So how did the Gaelic come to the area? What was its route in?
I mean, the trouble is we don't exactly know. It's harder to know. So we've got a really good sense for when Old English comes into the area, because it comes from a period where we've got some good historical information that tells us about the Northumbrian conquest of Galloway. I mean, not a lot of detail, but enough. Gaelic, on the other hand, probably came into the area in a period where the whole of the southwest of Scotland is just a virtual record vacuum, and place names are the only thing we've got to go on. We think that Gaelic probably comes in force, probably the kind of 9th century, 10th century, under the auspices of the people called the Galloway, the Scandinavian or Norse-seeming Gaelic speakers is probably what their name means. But the important thing is that they were Gael, they were Gaelic speakers. And they're the people who gave their name ultimately to the place, to Galloway. Originally, the word Galgael for Galloway covered really the whole of southwest Scotland, from Renfrewshire down to Annan. But at some point it got restricted to where it is now. So probably the 9th, 10th centuries, probably the whole of the Irish Sea is just an upheaval in the 9th and 10th centuries. And it's probably in some context like that. And the Gaelic may have been coming in from multiple places. So from the Hebrides, from people coming from Ireland, from the Isle of Man. So it's probably quite a complex heritage. But Galloway is so close to Ireland that you couldn't really guarantee that Gaelic wasn't kicking around in some form or other for some time before then. But it really looks like that period, that is the main period.
Okay, if we go a bit further down, a question got here from someone, Patillery. Looks like it contains the Pictish for pet.
I think it's highly unlikely. Pet is actually in almost all cases a Gaelic place name element, so that in all the places in Pictland where Pit names appear, the second element of it is almost always a Gaelic name, a Gaelic word. So it's a Pictish element which has been borrowed into Gaelic, and it's not a name. It's not an element, and which comes down this far southwest. It's possible that it's been corrupted in some way to form from an earlier name, which because pet is such a commonplace name element further north, whatever Pitellery was called originally might have been assimilated to the more familiar northern range of Pit names. But I really don't think it can be a Pictish place name or contain that Pictish word borrowed into Gaelic. I think that's highly unlikely. Also, Pit names are almost always decent farmland. It's a name for a small farm, not very small. And Patillery is not. It's a great big high hill at the top of Carrsfair, and it's not really farming land at all. So I really don't think it can. I had thought about that quite a lot. Is it Ailey who asked that question?
You have to go a long way up. Pet, yeah,
it was. She just said hello. Yeah, it was her. I don't think it can be Ailey. I mean, I don't think it can be Pet, Ailey. I think it must be either something assimilated to Pet or some word which we don't. Oh, it wasn't Ailey. No, she's denying it. So
It's recorded anyway who asked the question, so that'll go back and it'll go out in the transcript.
Okay.
It might be a different Ailey. We have a number of ecologists who've joined the meeting. And it's interesting, quite a number of them. I'm an ecologist myself, hence me struggling with the Gaelic names. But it's just as a note here, it's very interesting when you're trying to work out what happened and what was on and what should be in the landscape. It's a really interesting record back there. And someone did mention the pike, which I thought was quite interesting. Yeah, they mentioned that the pike is non-native species. It certainly is. I don't know myself a date came to this part of Galloway, but it was a long time ago. But pike were moved around a lot by for people to eat on Fridays. They're available all year round, and fresh fish, particularly when you went further inland, was difficult to get hold of. So often for religious fish eating connotations, pike were one of the fish which was moved around. Further south in England, carp were moved around, but carp, whilst it may have been moved up here, didn't survive our winters very well, whereas pike did. So yeah, pike are not native to anywhere on the west of Scotland, because we couldn't get in, because the only way of getting into the west of Scotland was to come in from the sea, and pike can't do that.
Would do that. Okay.
Yeah. And the other one was mentioned, if it's one of my own special, so eels are actually still are present, but functionally extinct in the Loch Ken, and that was prior to the dams, prior to the recent issues with eels. It was more to do with the Hydra scheme, which is not built with eels in mind. Then there's someone who, Mike Ansell's pointed out, there's very little evidence of Norse this far inland. There's been a few comments from Mike Ansell there regarding yellow trout and things like that. So
yeah, Mike is absolutely right about that. There are two possible names in our territory, and I would say they're both pretty dubious. One is Troudel, and one is right up on the western boundary, Grobdale. Both of them are remotely possible Norse names, but I think it's highly unlikely, especially given the fact that they're very minor features and very far from any other sign of Norse settlement. So all the important Norse names in our part of the world are on the coastal plain, really, with access to the sea and access to that world of Norse-speaking, sea-riding kingdom of the Irish Sea. Okay. Well, I think we're actually moving on. A far number of these questions have been answered here anyway. So I think, Thomas, you'll be moving now towards actually having a little bit of an investigation of the website. Do you want to have a few words about that?
So we're just going to give you another whistle-stop tour, but this time of a resource. So if you want to go and play with these place names yourself, you can now do it. And so this is probably the first time we've really put this material live to an audience. The site's been tidied up a bit for viewer consumption. Has to be said, it's still a work in progress. There's lots of stuff still to do, and we'd be very happy to hear about things we've missed out or problems with the site or anything like that. So if you go to it, this is the database this contains a lot of different things, but particularly the database that Gilbert has been populating over the last year or so. This is all brought together by a project team, mostly Gilbert, Marcus, who you've been hearing from, but also helped a bit by myself and by Dr. Simon Taylor, who many of you will know, and the systems developer for this, who made it look the way it looked and has fixed all our problems, is Brian Aitken, who's done a wonderful job but couldn't join us tonight. And just to say, there's some nice little blogs as well, if people don't know them already, going right back to the beginning of the project, where you can read some, mostly Gilbert, thinking about some of the aspects of the site. But what we really want to introduce you to is this bit of it, which is the first time this is now available, open to the public. which is the place names of the Galloway Glens part of the site. And this is the place where you can make searches, various different kinds of searches for place names. And I think Gilbert's going to talk to this, and I'm going to make it all happen.
We thought we'd start off with a name which to most people is completely probably opaque. And to start off with a little, you type the word Iron Losh into the little search window, and there it appears. If you can scroll down, that's it. There, the location of the name appears. Iron Losh on a map. A brief record of the place appears as you click the dot. But if you want the full record, you click the red button. And it gives you some information about it. First of all, it gives you the meaning. Before we go to historical forms, it gives you the meaning: burned portion or land division. That's the Eran word we discussed earlier on. Any notes on the site will appear here. If there's any feature of the landscape or the settlement or features of its history which seem relevant, we will put them in this little section of the database. The elements are discussed below. The historical forms, let's look at the historical forms. So now, Eran Lochja is the Gaelic, modern Gaelic form of the name. And you can see it's a name which has caused various scribes over the centuries a bit of difficulty. They've come up with various pretty strange spellings. But this is an important part of the process of understanding a name, is looking at the way it's been represented. Some scribes just copy what went in the previous document. Other scribes are actually listening to somebody saying a name, and it's not always easy to know what exactly is going on, how this particular form took shape in the particular scriptorium where it came from, where we first come across it. And then one of the exciting things you can do with a name like this, once you've finished digesting the early forms and things, and when you've finished thinking about this particular place, you could ask yourself, well, what about this element, Eran? What does it mean? Where does it appear? And you click on that little button, the Eran button on that analysis page. It's got 16 place, it appears in 16 place names. So this is it. This is the word now listed among all the elements that we have in our table of elements, okay, in the alphabetical order. But you see on the right-hand corner of that red block, it says there are 16 place names. If you click on that 16 place names, 17 now, you'll get a distribution map of all the Eran names. If Thomas can pull it down, that's it. Look at very interesting cluster, two interesting clusters, but it's extraordinary how the distribution of these Eran names. They're all in or close to the river valley. They're on arable land, the lower lying land on that river and loch line through our territory, the bottom of the glen. If you click on that left-hand display options button, go down to the bottom and find parish boundaries, click on that, then you'll see how these place names are distributed around the different parishes. And you can see that Balmaclellan, the northern part, then there's one in Parton, and there's another cluster in and around Crossmichael. So two quite separate clusters. And another interesting thing about these, as we hover our thing over the dots, we can see what the names are. So Erin McCarthy, that's the Erin of the McCarthy family. Erin McElwhinny, again a family name. Armanilli, Armacani, those are all family names. What's the one to the left of Armacani? Arncraig, well, that's not a family name, probably. Neither is that one. But if you go to the far right there, up a bit, no, that's it, that one. Ewanston, that was Erin McEwen once upon a time. Again, a family name. So there's a whole cluster of Erins specified by the family they belong to. If you go down to the southern cluster, you have Ernanati. Anat is an old Gaelic word for a kind of important early church foundation, Anat, or Anacha in the genitive. Ernambri contains the word ambri. It is the person or the office responsible for distributing arms for the church. We've got Ernfillan, possibly containing the saint's name, Fillan. Ernesby contains the word for the bishop, Espic, and up to the Ernkroger probably doesn't have an ecclesiastical thing. What about the bottom, down a bit? Yeah, that's probably not ecclesiastical either. But you can see there is a difference with the bishop, the alms-giving office, the Anat church, and then in the middle is Arnmanach in it's Ardmanach now, but all the early forms are Arn or Erin clearly contains, and that's the monks. So perhaps that should be included in the southern cluster of ecclesiastical-looking names, rather than the northern cluster of family names. So this is really, but it's partly the names themselves are interesting, and this kind of bifurcated group of Erin names with the families and the ecclesiastical sense. But it just gives you a sense of how to move around the database and the way you can squeeze it for extra information. Let's do a search. We're now in the advanced search section. I showed you the Gaelic place names containing Erin, not Gled yet. Let's go to Ern. One interesting thing about this word Ern was from Erin in Gaelic was loaned into Scots, and it's a very unusual word in Scots, but it appears again, if we can put the parish boundaries on again, you can see they all appear in that southern group where all the Erin names were in the ecclesiastical ones. We've got Black Ern, we've got Chapel Ern, again an ecclesiastical one, Half Ern, not ecclesiastical, and Ernambri. That should really be in the Gaelic, not the Scots display. We'll have to fix that. Okay, so again, we learned something else that there's.
I think it's because it's got a potential Scots second element. That's why I said.
Right, okay, that's grand. Let's look at gled, the old Scots word for a red kite. There we are. Interesting distribution here, because almost all the gleds that I've seen around our territory have been really down the south end, in kind of Lauriston sort of area. And here they're all being recorded toponymically, almost all of them. The 3 of the 4 are being recorded in the north. Again, interesting contrast. Of course, there may be issues about the survival of the names here, but are the red kites returning to a slightly different part of the country from the part where they historically used to flap about? Can we do a search on White Hill? Now look at all those places called White Hill. Every single one, they're all called White Hill. It's an extraordinary name. I sometimes wonder if perhaps we shouldn't really think of it as a name, but originally, but as more as a kind of designation of a particular part of a farm, any farm, as having a particular function. Perhaps the grass was kept long and white there, perhaps for winter feed or something like that. But then look at the way that all the White Hills are in the greener part of the countryside. Almost nothing in the browner highland areas. It's all dotted around in the good land at the bottom of the glens. It's a very revealing picture. So they're all small, low-lying hills associated with a particular farm, and presumably with some particular agricultural function, which I have not yet been able to figure out exactly what it is. But if anybody knows that, please do let us know. Let's do a contrasting search now. Let's look at dew, the Gaelic word, black, dew. So we'll search it under elements. D-U-B-H. And there are far fewer of them around. They don't tend to cluster by and large in the river valleys. There's a much more northerly shift to them, well, slightly more northerly shift to them. And I wonder if this is to do with the fact that some of these Dhu names are relating to peat, and especially those black rivers which flow off peat, or black lochs which lie in peaty ground. And can we try a search on the word black as well? So again, many more of them up in the north end than there were of the White Hill ones, up into the hilly part of the country. So the colour can sometimes reveal something about the quality of the land, and what the land is made of, what it's doing to the vegetation, what it's doing to the water that flows off it, and so on. Sometimes these contrasting patterns are, you can, by looking at just with your eye at a map and seeing that two different maps show a different kind of pattern, can be quite revealing about the way that elements are being used in place names. And finally, can we just do 2 searches? One for all the Old English names, which just means you go to the element language, select Old English, and go, without entering any other information. And you'll see that they form a pretty tight cluster. Can we put on the parish boundaries? The one in Balmaclellan parish is only possibly Old English. Could be a later, perhaps Scots. So the ones, we've got Dryborough, we've got another Dryborough, we've got Shermers, remember that, the boundary of the Shire. We've got Parton, and we've got Swinton, the pig farm. And it's interesting that the boundary burn, the Shermer, Schier Gemer, is on the northern boundary of that cluster of Old English place names that we're more confident about. I would leave the northern one out of this, actually. We're not at all confident about that. So that's quite an interesting pattern in itself. And finally, just to give a glimpse of another kind of search you can select a parish and a language, for example. So you can combine different fields. You can search in various combinations of different fields. And here's one: all the Gaelic names in Carsfern Parish. And this is how they appear. There we are, about 3 or 4 dozen of them. So this is really just to give you a little bit of a sense of the kind of ways in which the database can be used. It can be searched. You can choose different fields, select different time frames, select different kinds of feature, different kinds of language, different parishes within the area, and so on. And really, by playing with it, I think, just a bit of creative play during this lockdown period, things will just pop out at you as maps and lists and early forms offer themselves to you and provoke thought and inquiry. So thank you very much. That's our introduction, the launch. I felt we should somehow have broken a bottle of champagne somewhere, but
thank you everyone so much for attending. And also let you know that coming up next week on the 20th of May, we have the Can You Dig It team. We'll be delivering a little seminar on the progress they've made on their project and how community archaeology has been going on in the Galloway Glens area. So hopefully we can get some people joining us on that.